I would like to do a bit of housekeeping and acknowledgement to country. So just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, today we are recording this event so that it can go to the YouTube TASA channel and other students can watch this video in the future and learn from what we share today. The title of that we gave to this session is How to Navigate Conferences, Effective Presentation Strategies. And as I said, we are all getting ready for the TASA National Conference at the end of November, but this can be of help for any other conference that you might be attending. The session will be divided in 3 sections. We will have 5 to 10 minutes first, where our panelists that now I will introduce in a minute will be sharing a story that they want to share with us about presenting at a conference. And then we will jump into some questions that I have ready for them. And we will finish with some questions and answers. As I said, third thing is I want to encourage you to write questions on the chat so that then we can read them at the end and we make sure that we cover them. So yes, now is the moment. I would like to introduce 2 great speakers that we have today. They are both from WA, so I do have the pleasure to know them very well. We have Farida Fozdar. She's a professor of sociology and global futures at Curtin University. She teaches research methods and introductory sociology at Curtin and has published widely and given many conference papers, including over a dozen keynotes. Her research focuses on race, relations, and racism, citizenship, nationalism, post-nationalism, and cosmopolitanism, mixed race, and issues to do with refugees and asylum seekers. And then we have Dr. Catherine Ann Martin, has a PhD in sociology from the University of Western Australia, awarded in early 2021. Her interests center on race, migration, national identity, media, and discourse analysis. She has presented at conferences in Australia, Europe, and Canada, both in person and online. She currently works as a lecturer and tutor in the McCasker Center for Citizenship at UWA and in the Asian Studies Department at Murdoch University in Perth. So welcome, Farida and Kathy. Thank you very much for being here today. And yes, I would like to start asking you about that story, that moment where you presented at a conference that it's special for you. It can be your first time presenting at a conference or a time where you feel it was a special occasion for you in your career, because we all have those moments, other than me, that I couldn't have many opportunities at a conference. I'm sure you have one. So that's how I would like to start today before we move to some of the questions.
Okay, I'll go first, do my seniority thing. So Bernardo asked us for one story. I've got 3, so, but short. And the main thing is not the story, but the learning from it. So one of my first talks was I did my PhD in New Zealand, and yeah, so part of doing a PhD is often that you have to present to your department or your school. So yeah, so I prepared and prepared and prepared, but when I got into the talk, I realized that I had way too much material, and the idea of kind of cutting it down to fit the size, the time frame was impossible basically in the class. That was before we had PowerPoint, so I had lots of overheads, and I was trying to do something kind of interesting with the approach that I had taken, but I learned from that you need to be very careful about your timing. You need to try not to cover everything. You need to work out what the most important things are to convey to your audience, and also try not to confuse them. So that was something that I learned. And then I had another experience in the US where I was giving a talk at an intercultural studies conference. on mixed race. And kind of halfway through my presentation, one of the other presenters sort of stood up and said, "This is not how we talk about race anymore." And he was very, very angry. And I'm not quite sure what it was, but I think what what had concerned him was that I was presenting quite a positive, and this, you know, it was data driven, right? But it didn't support his perception of the particular topic. It didn't support his findings, and so he actually reacted quite aggressively in the session. So much so that I actually felt so upset. You know, this sort of fight or flight kind of reaction. And normally, you know, normally I fight, but I just felt so uncomfortable that I actually left. I actually walked out of the session. Happy ending. I've written a paper that was just published actually in a special issue with the title, "This is not how we talk about race anymore." And I use that vignette as the start to segue into a discussion of the different ways in which we were talking about race, and the perception that this scholar had from the US and his assumptions about how that experience and that research should translate, should be completely kind of imported into other contexts, which you know, I think is inaccurate.
Was it the way he was asking you the question, or was it the way he was interpellating your ideas? I mean, yeah, I guess it was only kind of after the fact that I worked out what was going on. It was such a shocking thing. I mean, you can't imagine somebody standing up in the middle of your presentation, you know, and you're kind of happily giving your presentation and so on. Someone stands up and very aggressively says, you know, what you're saying is wrong, out of date, inappropriate, you know, wow.
that phrase, "This is not how we talk about race anymore." But he didn't actually explain what it was that he meant. So it's only in retrospect when I looked back at his work and I thought, oh God, you know, this is some important scholar that, you know, I've somehow missed, but it wasn't. And yeah, so you know, it was a combination of things. I think it was inappropriate, but it was an interesting experience. I don't want to freak people out either. You know, this is not common. It's notable. It's special, as you asked, Bernardo, because it was so unusual and strange.
Yeah.
And the third story is a very short one, which is I was very honoured last year to be asked to give the keynote for the annual TASA conference. Of course, I didn't get a free flight to TASA because of it, because it was online. But I spoke, you know, I've been doing work on national values statements, and I was in the middle, and part of the reason for them to invite me was because I had been, I basically was about to lose my job at the University of Western Australia, because the University of Western Australia removed its anthropology and sociology department, basically. And we all lost our jobs as a result. And I got very interested as part of that process in institutional values. So I kind of developed a talk that combined this interest in national values statements with institutional values statements, and looked at the values statement of my institution and the ways in which we were treated, the process that staff had gone through, and the lack of integrity which that process demonstrated. And afterwards, I realized, whoa, this was recorded. And I was kind of being a little bit careful in terms of what I said, but it occurs to me that exists on the TASA website now, and any potential future employer can go back and see that. I don't think I said anything defamatory, but you know, again, it's sort of not a thing that you might think about when you're preparing a presentation. So I'm coming at kind of weird angles with this, and I do have some much general kind of tips for good conference presentations in the third part of our discussion. But I just thought those were some interesting stories since we were asked to give some.
Thank you, Farida, for sharing these stories. I found the second one in US very personal, so thank you very much for sharing that. So I'm very interesting as well, coming from a professor, but now we have Kathy, who is our early career researcher, and I would like to listen to your story, Kathy, from another perspective. I'm sure that we can learn from it as well.
Okay, so I'm going to also talk about a slightly an experience where someone shouted at me as well at a conference. So please don't, I don't want to scare people. It wasn't at an academic conference. It was at a migration conference in Canada. And I was still a student at the time. And I think one of the reasons I wasn't prepared for it is because it doesn't happen to you at academic conferences. Generally, and certainly not as a student, you're unlikely to be shouted at at a conference. So I was in Canada at the Metropolis conference, and I was presenting my paper, my first paper, which was on queue jumping, the queue jumping metaphor, and talking about asylum seekers, and all the rest of the panel were from the US or Canada, and the Australian consul or whatever she was, she decided to come, and she came in very kind of, you know, just rich and middle-aged and kind of very, very sure of herself. And she was furious when she heard me talking about Australia. She was not happy at all. And at the end, she just started to shout, you know, like, well, how can you say this? What are you saying? People, are you saying we don't have the right to protect our borders? So I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about, you know, this very, you know, that these discourses are being applied to certain groups. They're racializing, you know, and she's, no, you're saying this, you're saying that. And she kept yelling at me, you know, what about sovereignty? What about sovereignty? What about a nation's right to protect its borders? And so the other people on the panel also started speaking up at this point, going, well, we're not saying that a nation doesn't have a right to protect its borders. At which point I stopped talking, because I'm thinking, I'm not sure, kind of, you know, that there's something going on here. And she kept going, well, you know, what about sovereignty? And in the end, she got up and walked out. And it was stressful. It was stressful for me, because I honestly, as a student, was not expecting that. And it was just so much kind of, you know, kind of rage coming at me. But I would say the question has stuck with me, and that's what I'm actually going to be presenting on this year at TASA, is a paper on the use of sovereignty, because you know, at the time I didn't really have the I guess the hadn't thought about it enough to be able to give a coherent reply to this question, well, what about sovereignty? And I think that's understandable, you know, as a student. But that's one of the things that I would say that comes out of these encounters, even if they are quite negative and someone's quite angry, that anger can give you something that you can then think about and kind of go away. And it's kind of went to the back burner, but it was just at the back of my mind, what's going on here? Why does she feel like this is an okay argument to make? And she obviously did. So at the time, I think one of the things that I do think that people should do in those situations is not allow someone to say, you're saying this. Well, no, that's not what I'm saying. You know, don't allow someone, no matter how kind of, well, you're saying, no, that's not what I'm saying. But don't worry about that happening to you as well at an academic conference. It won't. It wasn't an academic conference. And certainly as a student, no one's ever going to shout at you. You know, as an early career researcher, or as a you know, a postgraduate, as a HDR student, no one's going to shout at you, I promise. So that was my experience. I've had lots of other good, nice experiences, but that was probably my most memorable one.
Thank you, Kathy. As a PhD student without a lot of experience presenting at conference, what I take from your stories is that when we are preparing for this kind of national and international conference, we have to be very mindful of the way we structure our presentation and what we actually say, not saying that we don't have to say what we want to say, but the way we present, because we might get, I mean, one thing is to present at a university level, at a seminar, or in a research week. Another thing is presenting with big audiences that are coming from all over the world with different ideas. So the discussion, I'm sure it can get really, really interesting at those levels. So I'm really looking forward to attending the TASA conference and presenting there. And as I'm reading here in the chat, TASA is always a nice place to present at, so that's fantastic. And actually, your stories take us to the questions in a really good way, because the three questions that I prepared for today are for PhD students. I thought them from a PhD student perspective, but I really also want to hear how, from your position as a professor, Farida, or from early career researcher, Kathy, can benefit you. So the first question that I have for you is in regards to opportunities that we can find at this type of conferences. I don't want to even give you examples, because I really want to hear the answer from you, but I really want you to focus as well in the role of PhD students, because we might have a lot of PhD students in the participants, but also in your current roles. I mean, what type of opportunities you can find in these conferences. So let's start with Farida. We can follow the same order as we had before. So Farida, what are the opportunities that you find at these type of conferences, national or international level?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I'm not particularly systematic. So what I found kind of early on in my academic career, which started late, so I did my PhD in my late 30s, and so I've only been an academic since I was 40 or so. Yeah, I found that it's important to develop a sense of kind of community. And so the idea of going regularly to one's association conference, so in this instance TASA, but while I was doing my PhD in New Zealand, the Sociological Association of Aotearoa New Zealand conference as well, that it's a safe sort of place to present one's work. You are directly engaging with people who know about your topic area. First of all, they're sociologists, and then kind of within the particular stream that you're in, you know, there are people who are experts in your area, and therefore can provide kind of useful feedback and engagement. So I think there is incredible value in PhD students making that a habit, as often as they can afford it, to go along to and you know, develop the connections and so on. And TASA is really good, again, about you know, providing opportunities for postgrad students in this respect. And again, I'll have a little side comment about UWA, that we had set up a fund for West Australian students to be able to come over to TASA conferences, but UWA absorbed that money when it got rid of us. And it also absorbed my money, which means that I'm funding my own personally, because I don't have access to some conference funding here at Curtin yet. I'm funding my own trip to TASA this year, and that just, you know, demonstrates, and you know, I know I'm on a much higher salary than all of you are, but that's my commitment to being part of this community, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of my wonderful colleagues there who I've missed for the last 3 years. But there are lots of, there are a number of websites that have a bunch of conferences on them. I think the TASA website itself also, you know, has information about the conferences that are coming up, and that also occurs in the newsletter that comes out. The International Sociological Association also has information about conferences, and you can just kind of Google sociological conferences as well to get a sense of what is around. There are pros and cons to going to kind of large conferences, such as the International Sociological Association World Congress, which is coming up in Melbourne next year. This is a conference of between 5,000 and 10,000 people. It's a massive conference, and you can feel very alone in such a conference. So what you need, again, a hint, go to one stream, okay? Just don't session hop, or session hop minimally. If you go to one stream, you get to know the people who are there, the people who are kind of interested in the same sort of stuff that you're interested in. You can talk to the speakers in between sessions and, you know, over lunch and so on about their work, and you feel less lost and kind of more connected. But there is a value to going to such big conferences, because you get your name out there and you get a sense of, some of the keynotes can be amazing. And you get a sense of kind of the latest thinking within your discipline. So I would say that it's valuable for that. But I do also, I would say I prefer small scale conferences of kind of, less than 50 people that are targeted right on the topic area or a particular method that you're using. So I've been to a few conferences on kind of critical discourse analysis or conversation analysis and so on. And again, you get that sense of community and connection, but also, intensive time to really think about and learn about the latest within that particular area. So those are a kind of a range of, I guess, things that guide my decisions about which conferences to go to.
Thank you, Farida. And Kathy, do you find any opportunities from your perspective that can be good for PhD students, but also from your new role now as a early career researcher?
I mean, there's a lot of opportunities, I think. I think it's an opportunity, first of all, for someone to actually listen to what you're doing. You spend all this time doing your work, and I think especially as HDR students, I know that when I first started going to conferences, I found it really, really stressful. Felt like I had to put on a performance of what I was doing and it had to be perfect. Whereas now I don't see conferences like that. I mean, I'm quite happy to go to a conference and say, I'm still figuring this out. I want some feedback, and I think actually saying, oh, look, I'm interested in getting some feedback. It's a way to get people who are, if they're kind of following the streams, who are interested in your area, to actually give you some feedback. People who aren't familiar with your work, it's a way to, it can be a great experience in terms of getting new perspectives, getting new ideas, figuring out how to approach a problem, particularly if you're stuck on something. I think when I first started, I really did feel like you have to know the answers. But actually, no, you don't. The whole point of a conference is that it's a forum to discuss these things. So, you can say, this is the conversation that I'm starting, and treat it as a conversation as opposed to like a lecture. It's not a lecture, it's a conference presentation. So I find that it can be really useful in that sense. You can get some really interesting, helpful feedback, I think. And also, I think, it's a great way to meet people. It is a great way to meet people. It can be daunting, especially in the big conferences. I mean, that said, the conference where I got shouted at, Metropolis, is a big conference in Canada. And aside from that incident, it was probably the friendliest conference I've ever been to. And I didn't know anyone, and people were just chatting to you all over. And I was chatting to people who were working in the immigration department and people working in all these different spheres to do with migration. And it was really, really interesting. And they were all coming just to learn about migration. So there was this real kind of cross-pollination of people who were just open to learning. And so it wasn't a sociology conference. It wasn't there was a huge, really diverse set of people there. And it was actually a really, really interesting conference to go to. So I think meeting people, making some of those connections, hearing about interesting work that might actually inspire you in your work as well. And getting some of that, it's a great place to grow and learn, I think. I think that's the biggest opportunity at a conference.
Thank you, Kathy. And yes, I totally agree about meeting people, but I also find very interesting I'm a sociologist. I'm going to the TASA conference. I find very interesting to be with people from your same discipline, because one of the first questions that I had when I moved with my wife 10 years ago here to WA is, where are the sociologists? I wanted to have a chat with them. I mean, I wanted to share because I love my discipline, and I do like going to the TASA conference because it feels good to be with people that read the same literature. And we talk the same language, and I agree as well that it's nice to go into international conference where you have people scholars from different disciplines. I also find very interesting as a PhD student to go to a conference where you know that the people you read might be there, and you can even have the option of asking them questions. It happens to me a lot that I'm reading a paper and I would love to ask this question to this scholar, like, why is he or she going that way? I would love to know why about something. So when I'm going to the TASA conference, I know that some of those scholars that I read on a daily basis for my PhD, they are going to be there. And some of them are presenting, so I know that I can be there. So I find that as fantastic opportunity. But the next question is about challenges. You did mention some before about someone asking you challenging you through a difficult question. But I would like to hear more about challenges that as PhD students we can, challenges that we can face at this type of big conferences, from your perspective as a professor, Farida, an early career researcher, Kathy, but also from from the perspective from a PhD student, because as you already presenting your stories, we know that it's not the same to present at that level. So let's focus now on some challenges. So Farida, if you would like to share with you some challenges that you find when attending this type of big conferences, and then we can move to you, Kathy.
Could I let Kathy speak first, because I feel as though I'm taking all the ideas and then Kathy might miss out. So let's just swap the order just for this. Thank you. Thanks, Bernardo.
So some of the challenges that I think I've found, certainly as an early, in my early presentations, well, one of them is what Farida said earlier, is trying to say too much, putting everything on the slides, wanting to say it all, and then rushing through it, like, trying to get it all out and trying to say it all. And I think not actually making sure that your presentation, you need to be able to speak slowly and clearly, and you need to only have enough, anything more than that, you need to cut it out. And I think certainly as early at the beginning, and I think when you're so immersed in a subject, it can be hard to know what to cut out and what to leave in, and what are the bare bones. But I think it's fine, as you're going through the presentation, to be saying, I can speak more about this in questions. You can leave lots of it, because if there's anything that's unclear, people will ask you in the question. So if you haven't given enough detail, there is definitely cut it back. That's my first thing, is trying to say too much. Another thing that I find personally is when I get nervous, I start talking with my hands and moving them around, and I look like I'm probably, I probably don't look well. I try really hard not to. And one of the things that someone said to me, which really helped, was to hold something in your hand, something small in your hand, and just keep it there to stop you, because it can be like, I taught for years before I started doing, before I went and did my PhD, and I find talking in front of a class, but once I went, especially the first few times of conference presenting, my heart was going. I was really, really nervous. I don't know why it made me so nervous, but I think one of the things that made me so nervous, and this is, I think one of the challenges that we face when we're PhD students, is we're terrified of what comes after the presentation. We're terrified of the questions, because you think, oh my God, how am I going to answer all these questions? What if someone asks me something I don't know? What am I supposed to say? What if I can't think on the, and it's like, you feel like you have to know it all, and you have to be ready for all of the questions. And you get through the presentation and you get to the end and you're like, shit, what happens now? It can be really scary, I think. And my story that I told notwithstanding, where there was a really angry person asking questions, for the most part, you don't need to worry about the questions. If you're not expected to know the answer. You can go, oh, I never thought about that. You can. It's not a test. It can feel like you're in the spotlight and you're in the courtroom and people are firing questions at you, but that's really not what it's about. It's a chance for you to talk a bit more and to explain a bit more. You're not expected to know everything. You're not expected to be kind of God, omnipotent, all-knowing, all-seeing. It's okay to just not know the answer. It's okay to go, I didn't think of it from that perspective. It's okay to say, I haven't come across that reading. You're not expected to know it all. So I think not being scared of the question, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges for me, certainly, was first of all, how do I get through it? And then once I've got through it, how do I deal with all of these questions from people that are probably way smarter than me, way more experienced than me? I'm going to feel, it's very easy to be intimidated when you have professors with 20 years of reading and, you know, writing and presenting, asking you a question, and you feel like, what do I know? But you can just say what you know, and if you don't know it, that's okay. That would be my thing.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Farida?
Thanks, Kathy. Some really useful points there. So yeah, just to reiterate, one of the points that I've got on some of my tips is this same point that you started with, that less is more. I always think more is more, and I never practice what I preach in this respect. So I always run out of time whenever I'm presenting. When I'm lecturing, always run out of time. So yeah, but that's not to say that we shouldn't be aiming for kind of working out what to focus on in our presentation, so that it's a bite-sized piece for the audience. As Kathy says, you can elaborate during the question time and so on. And so this is one of the one skill that I think is really important for students to try to develop. And another suggestion is to try to preempt criticism. So within your presentation, recognize the limitations, recognize if you've got a small sample size or if it's a particular sample or whatever. Recognize you're talking about a particular context and you're not making claims about generalizability into other contexts or whatever. If you preempt some of those criticisms, then it sort of diffuses the people who might, want to challenge what you're saying. Yeah, so that's just another sort of approach to take. And yeah, so another one of my tips that I put here was to choose a safe audience. When you're, as you're developing as a scholar, choose safe audience. So if you have an opportunity to present to your fellow PhD students, do that. If you have an opportunity to present within your department or your school, then do that. But I've also put in brackets with that one, maybe, that sometimes there can be a benefit to engaging with I wouldn't say a hostile audience, but a critical audience, because it does, you will come up with some interesting questions that, as Kathy says, you can say, I never thought of that. And that's partly what the internal presentations that are built into your PhD candidacy are for, that scholars will ask you interesting questions that you haven't thought about, and you'll realize that, yeah, that's a direction you need to kind of think about and write about, or that it's a direction that you need to kind of preempt and say, this is why I'm not dealing with that particular question or issue. So those are just a few ideas, and then we'll come to some of the other ideas when we're talking about.
Thank you, Farida. The last question that I prepared for today, I would like to come up with some, you've been sharing tips, but I would like to hear from you when you start getting prepared for a conference. What are actually the steps? You have a paper, right? You want to present an idea at a conference. So I would like to hear from you in terms of what you do. Do you prepare slides? You prepare first to summarize? I mean, all the steps that you take before you present at the conference. You might have different styles. That's why I want to ask you this question. And your styles might maybe changed through time. Maybe it was not the same, Farida, when you presented in New Zealand from what you do now when you present at a conference. Or also it has to do with the training you have. I mean, your speaking skills and the way you are now presenting. But I think that the answer to this question can be of help for all of us, that we are getting ready for a conference. I have a paper that I'm going to be presenting. So actually, all the tips that you are sharing with us today are being of great help, because it's helping me to think, okay, what do I need to do in the next few weeks before the conference in terms of preparing? Do I need to do slides and I will get a summary? How do I have to present visuals? I want to present more like vignettes. So that's kind of things that I would like to ask you. So strategies to navigate a conference. In this case, the TASA conference, but it can be any other conference you attended in the past. So I don't know who you would like to start. Now you, Farida, would like to start with some tips, and then we can move to Kathy.
Sure. Thanks, Bernardo. Yeah, the initial question that you asked there around PowerPoint versus kind of developing a script and so on. I haven't actually had that as one of my questions in my list of tips. And I guess I sometimes I do it one way, sometimes I do it the other. So for the TASA keynote, and generally if I'm doing a keynote, I do prepare a script. So I've got my PowerPoint there as well, but I do write it out, and that helps to keep me to time. And I have little bits that I identify bits that I can cut out if I'm running over time or whatever, or, that I can just sort of summarize into a sentence rather than reading out a whole paragraph. And I highlight those or, tag them in some way. So I think that's quite useful. But in terms of listening to presentations, I much prefer to listen to non-scripted presentations. It's just much more engaging to hear somebody kind of talking to their slides rather than kind of reading from a script. So, yeah, I guess there's a difference between what I will do in some instances and what my preference is in terms of being an audience member. And I think we just adapt to what's going to work for us. That sense of nerves. I have nerves regardless of how I'm presenting, but particularly if I'm presenting as a keynote, I like the safety net of having my script there kind of already prepared, etc. So that's one thing.
Do you actually, sorry to interrupt you, Farida, but do you actually read it, or you try to like prepare it and learn it, and you try to avoid reading from your?
I would tend to read it. My memory is not good enough to remember it. So I do try to read it, but I try to sort of embellish it a little bit so that it's not just a reading voice, but there's vignettes that I can just sort of tell myself, or little sort of asides that make it a bit more interesting and so on.
Right.
Yeah. So then just a few more of these sort of tips, and this is sort of related, I guess, to what we were just talking about. Think about telling a story as part of your presentation, and often it's a good way, kind of a segue into your presentation. And so either some sort of personal story or something that's relevant in the current news something that's going to be relevant and of interest, and kind of make the audience kind of sit up and pay attention, rather than, and often that's the way you can introduce your paper, rather than just starting off reading out your title and reading out what the background literature and your method and so on. Think about some way of making it a bit more interesting, a bit more exciting than that by telling a vignette or relating it to something kind of current in the news. I also, because I'm so useless at keeping time, I've learned that I need to start with my conclusion, and often I'll make that a little joke at the start. Here's my final slide, just so that, but it actually helps the audience to orient to your, where you're going with your presentation. Because without it, even if you say, this is the structure of my presentation, I'm going to talk about this and that, and then my conclusion. It actually allows them to see what you're saying throughout your presentation through the lens of that conclusion. So that's another tip, but don't steal it from me, because then everybody will be starting with their conclusions. Have all these TASA papers this year.
All the conclusions first.
Then one, and this is also related to kind of presentation style, is before you actually get up there to start, remind yourself how enthusiastic you are about your discipline, how much you love the work that you're doing, how much you enjoy the opportunity to be able to share with other people your findings, how exciting it is to have done the research and now be able to share it with people. And that will give you an impetus in the way you present, which will be very engaging for the audience. There's nothing worse than, again, that sort of rote, kind of just straightforward manner of delivery. So yeah, so think about that. So you can give all sorts of tips about body language and all that sort of stuff. You can go and Google that stuff. But I think this thing of kind of trying to give your talk with impulsion, with a sense of that enthusiasm that you have for your discipline, I think that's really important. Then just a few more points. In your presentation, don't just, and this is true for your thesis as well, don't just describe, analyze. So don't just put up a bunch of quotes from, this is what somebody said about this is what somebody said about that, or here are some tables and graphs. Make sure that you're working to convey your analytical understanding of the research that you've done. And audiences like frameworks. So if you pinch somebody else's framework and use that as a lens through which to talk about your data, or better still, develop your own kind of framework, that it offers a value add to just the straight description of, I went out, I did these interviews, this is what people said. Sorry, this is a bit random. In your PowerPoints, there's big discussions around how much text should go on them and what size the font should be and all that sort of stuff. The only tip that I would give is to use beautiful images. That and I've seen some people give entire presentations where the only thing on their PowerPoint is images, which I think is very brave and it's very engaging. So that's something to think about as well. Then finally, just to practice. Again, make sure you've got time under control, and to make sure you're comfortable with your material. And Bernardo asked, do I read from a script if I've prepared one for, say, a keynote? And yes, as I said, I tend to read from it, but I'm fully familiar with what I'm wanting to say, so that if somebody took that script away, I could deliver, an 80% version of it. So make sure that you're familiar and have practiced your presentation.
Great, Farida. Thank you very much. We already have a great list of tips. So, Kathy, do you have any other tips that you would like to share with us?
I don't know if there are other. I maybe want to extend a little bit on what Farida was saying. In terms of being, I'll tell you something that someone told me to do. I think she called it like the Wonder Woman pose, and she said, "Are you supposed to do it before you present?" She said, "Just go into the toilet and be like." And I was like, no, you can't do that. But I actually did it, and I went out going, so it's fine. Don't do it in front of people because they'll think you're weird. But go to the toilet before you present and be like, yes, just stand up, pull your shoulders back, actually generate that sense of, I am kind of powerful, I'm strong, I can do this. In terms of this script versus freestyle, so the first time I ever presented, I freestyled it, and it was in the discipline presentation, and I just found myself rambling, and I got tongue-tied because I was nervous. So I think if you're nervous, a script is probably a good idea. I do think, if you have to be very, very comfortable with what you're presenting, and also comfortable with presenting to be able to kind of freestyle it. And what I tend to do is I print off my notes from the PowerPoint. So you've got the slide with the notes and the script written underneath it, and I have it on my iPad. So I don't actually have to think which slide am I speaking to. So when I get to the end of that bit, I know to just put on the next slide. Because I think sometimes if you've got a script and slides and you're trying to manage them, you need to have them together. So you've got the slide with the script underneath it, then the next slide. And if you've got it in your iPad, you can just be scrolling through, so you're not shuffling through loads and loads of papers, because that can also be scary. You're like, how am I going to manage all of this? I think in terms of putting the conclusion at the front, I think it's okay to say, this is my argument. Having a thesis statement like you would in an essay, this is what I'm arguing. Because if you don't tell people what you're arguing, you don't have to give them the full conclusion, but you do have to tell people what you're arguing, because sometimes you go to a presentation and you're like, not really sure what I'm supposed to be taking from this. I'm not really sure what the argument is until the end. So definitely having that quite clearly at the beginning, I think is helpful. And I think in terms of being able to speak, what I do is I time myself. I read through my script a few times and I'm timing myself. And if it's going over when I'm at home, I'm cutting, because I know that what I'm doing at home is going to be the most relaxed. So you need to be reading it through a few times, reading it through, timing yourself, looking at where you can, because you'll have what doesn't look like a lot of text underneath the slide, but when you actually come to speak it, it can actually turn into, 4 or 5 minutes of you going into way too much detail. So timing yourself, looking at how much you've got for each slide, I think is one of the ways that you can keep yourself snappy, prepare so that that you're not getting bogged down in one particular point. And then looking at how, if you've got too much there, well, what's the key point? What can I take out? What do I need to keep here? So definitely timing yourself so that, yeah, you are absolutely, what you're going to say, you've said it. And I mean, don't just read it in your head, say it out loud. You have to actually practice saying it out loud, which feels a bit, dumb. But again, no one's there, no one's watching you, or, get someone to watch you. I mean, if you've got other postgrads, do it in front of each other, get that feedback, get that support, so that when you do go to present, it's certainly not the first time. Dorinda, yeah. So, practice, definitely practice. Get yourself ready so that how long it's going to take. That if you stick to what you've planned, you're not going to go over. I think some of those strategies to manage presenting. And one other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of strategies is that it can be quite nerve-wracking being at a conference, I think, especially when you're new, and especially if you're not particularly, I mean, I'm quite outgoing in most situations, but in conferences, I can feel I don't feel sociable. I don't feel like going up, and you see people working the room, and I don't like to do that. I find it uncomfortable. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like going up, and I was like, oh, does everyone else find it so stressful? Actually, a lot of people do find it quite stressful. One of the things I found presenting, a lot of people find it stressful. And one of the things I would say is, don't feel like you have to work a room. You can go up to the presenter and talk to them afterwards. Presenters love it when you come up and say, hey, I loved your talk, and ask them questions. It's a really good way to, to talk to somebody, or just go and speak to, to one person. Don't let that anxiety of being in a room full of people. Sometimes you think they all know each other and you feel like the new kid at school. And it's horrible. It can feel really, especially if you're kind of an anxious person. But just trying to kind of be prepared for that and be, just think, I'm going to talk to one person. I'm going to go and talk to the speaker. Or I'm going to, and not feel too overwhelmed by the fact that there's a conference full of people that you don't necessarily know. Because I think that can actually be, even for those of us that seem most confident and outgoing, it can also still be quite an intimidating process. So definitely to try and be aware of that and manage that, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that we are recording this session, because we have a lot of tips that we will be able to go through them before getting ready. I just wanted to add one that as a PhD I find really useful before we move some questions and answers. As is in regards to the slides, and I always find really boring or to go to presentations where there are just slides and chunks of text. And I know that you did talk about this, but I find a really good strategy is to prepare a great presentation. I mean, having a great script, it's really important, because it's our paper, our ideas, they're all there. But if we decide to do it through slides, I find really useful to use Canvas, spreadsheet, or other or PowerPoint. But if we use PowerPoint, if I use PowerPoint, I try to make sure that there are images, nice vignettes, a nice design, because people are actually watching those slides during the whole presentation. And if they are not engaging, that can be negative for our presentation. So that's the only tip. And I did really well presenting with Prezi in the past, which it's a really good tool. But saying that, I really want to leave some time. We have 8 minutes for some questions, because I haven't had the chance to read the chat, but there is a lot going on there. So let me try to pick a few questions from let me try to, I see that there's a lot of conversation in the chat at the moment. I'm trying to find any question. If anyone wants as well to maybe react and turn on the microphone, maybe it's gonna be better than reading the whole chat because there's a lot going on there. So maybe it's better. I mean, if anyone has any question that would like to share with Kathy and Farida, just to turn on your microphone and go for it, because I think it's gonna be quicker than reading all these comments and questions. I have a few questions, but I want to leave it to you guys first. Anyone has?
There's a question from Claudia.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's an interesting one.
What would you do if at the time of your presentation, you only have top line results, no real conclusions?
I mean, I'll go first. I mean, I don't have the conclusion for what I'm presenting. I'm still trying to figure it out. That's one of the reasons I'm presenting it. You know, I want to get some feedback. I think it's absolutely fine to just say, look, I don't have the answers yet. I'm figuring this out, and to get some feedback on that, and to get some help with that. I think that's, I mean, I hope it's fine because it's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're saying that, because that was kind of my plan.
Yeah. I think I mean, Farida's got a lot more experience than me, but certainly from my perspective, I think it's absolutely fine to just go, look, this is all I've got so far. This is the beginning. And to get, because it's a great time to be presenting, I think, you know, before you go down one track and not actually see all the options.
Yeah. And, you know, yeah, just you can say this is a work, you start off preempting the criticism. You say this is a work in progress paper, and I'm, you know, really pleased at the opportunity to be able to seek your feedback on it. And da, 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 da. And also if you're kind of halfway through your data collection, you don't even have that much to share with people, you can then, you know, take 2 or 3 case studies, you know, if you're doing interviews or something like that, and say, you know, these are interesting things that are seem to be coming through in the data. It's, you know, yeah, it's always, as with a thesis or writing a paper, it's good to try to work out what was my research question, what is the thing I'm trying to answer, and you can do that with a talk as well. You can say, well, you know, this is the research question that I'm trying to answer, and these are some of the initial things that I'm finding, but you know, there's a whole lot more to go, and I would appreciate, you know, people's feedback on you know, what they see in the data.
Yeah. Okay. And can I, whilst I'm here, can I ask another question in terms of the content? You know, we've been saying a lot, don't say too much, but of course we have all this content that we have to narrow down. So what do we focus on? Yeah, I suppose that's as simple as that. Do we focus on the findings, or, you know, the little that we have found out? Do we focus on the context and the method, or do you understand what I'm saying?
I mean, I think Farida's probably better again position to answer, but I would say the methods, unless you've done something really incredibly innovative and new, you can go through those pretty quickly. I think, I mean, I'd be more interested in hearing, what have you found?
Yeah.
What have you got? You know, I think there is this kind of tendency, especially, to feel like we've got to really explain how we did it. And I think you can do that quite briefly. And if people want to know more, they can ask more, unless you develop some incredibly unique method that it's integral to understand and that people won't know about. You can just kind of briefly, you know, it draws on these theorists. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to give a little bio for each of the people. You know what I mean? Like, just keep it nice and brief. I mean, I'm more interested in what have you found, you know, and how are you interpreting it? How should I interpret it? You know, you know, what do you want me to think about this?
Yeah. Okay, that's what I thought. All right, thanks.
Yeah, you know, I agree as well. And again, you know, you can, well, as Kathy said, you don't leave the method out, but you can put a lot of it just up in a slide and kind of briefly touch on it. Some people give presentations that are based on their lit review, and that's fine, so long as it's not just a summary of the literature. It should be about what are the key things that the literature is showing. What are the key gaps, etc. So it should be kind of that one level up from just a description of, you know, this study found this and this study found that. And, you know, that can be interesting as well without presenting any new data, because it's a you know, an overview, an analytical overview of the literature in the field. So yeah, you know, people give all sorts of different types of papers, and there often is a method stream. So if you did do something, as Kathy said, that is innovative in terms of method, then by all means, you know, it should go into that stream probably. But yeah, within the kind of the topic-led streams, then pick something that you think would be of interest to the audience. Tell them what it is that you've chosen and why, and then yeah, then just tell us a few things about it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Farida, and thank you, Claudia. We have a couple of minutes, so if anyone has any other question that would like to ask to Kathy or Farida. I have one that is actually this session. It's about navigating conference. So we hear a lot that people talking about networking. This is not about presenting at the conference, but going to a conference and finding work opportunities, or co-writing a paper, or designing a project with a colleague. I mean, and that has to do with ways we navigate conference as well. So I hear a lot about the networking. So I would like to hear from you, from your perspective, of your experience, if this is real. It's actually something that you can, I mean, start writing a paper with a colleague from a conference, or thinking of ideas, or anything that you have to share about networking at the conferences.
Well, look, I find it hard. I do find it hard. I'm not a natural networker, you know, and I do think it is, you know, I think there are opportunities there, and I think, but it is hard to manage, and I think it's okay to struggle with it. You know, I don't think it's something that you need to feel bad about. You know, I would say that there are opportunities, but you're not going to get them if you put a lot of pressure on yourself to go out there and find them, especially if it's making you feel horrible. You know, like if I go into a room and I think I've got to meet everyone in here, it makes me, you know, whereas, you know, I mean, like I said, going up to the speaker, you know, if you've enjoyed a presentation, at the end, go up and talk to the speaker, because that might be something that, you know, the way you can start, if it does have some sort of kind of synergy or with your work, then you can say, oh, look, I'm working in this field, and, you know, you can start to keep in touch. You can, you know, send each other papers or whatever. You know, and I think that can be the beginning of those kinds of relationships. And I think, you know, Farida was saying before about going through the stream. I think that's one of the ways that you can actually start to network, because you will start to see the same people, and you'll start to feel less kind of intimidated about going up to them and saying hi in that little voice. But it, you know, I think they are there, but I think Farida's probably better place to discuss how you can get the most out of them.
I hate the way in which kind of management ideas have found their way into everything that we do. And I think this notion of networking is perhaps one of them. I never think in terms of networking that oh, I must go up and speak to that person, because what the hell are you going to say to them? You know, I'm you know, important for this reason, and I think you're important for that reason, and let's get our important bits together. And, you know, I mean, it's icky, as you said. It should be much more organic, I think, and that's the point I think that Kathy's making, and that's, you know, yeah, I don't know, that's my way of interacting with people. I'll never forget, a bunch of Australians were at it was a conference on kind of intercultural studies, not the other one I mentioned in the US, but this was over in Ireland. And there were opportunities to network with, you know, people from Europe and the UK and so on there. But all the Aussies just hung out together. And it was partly because we sort of knew each other, partly because we were spread across Australia. And so this was one opportunity for us all to be kind of, yeah, to be sharing ideas and so on. And that's the sort of environment where you do, it's hard to get, you know, Bernardo's question about, oh, you know, is it realistic to expect that you might decide to co-author with somebody, you know, that you've met at a conference? It's only realistic after you have developed a relationship with that person. It's not going to happen at a conference. And the other thing to say is that the conferences apparently in the US, and I've never actually been to one of these, but in the US kind of National Association conferences are actually specifically designed as a meat market where people kind of do interviews and so on for actual jobs as part of the conference. And so everybody knows that everybody is there for the purpose of kind of finding a job. And that's not how things work here. Thank goodness, because I think, you know, that our conferences are much more intellectual opportunities for engagement and for the building of kind of a professional community, rather than, you know, being seen as opportunities for getting ahead, sort of thing, which I just, you know, that just seems sort of bizarre to me. And you know, that's not to say that, you know, that things don't happen, that an opportunity for a research assistant job, you know, might be mentioned, or that there's, you know, a postdoc coming up here or there, or, you know, somebody's putting in for an ARC and that might be right up your alley, etc. These things do occur, but it's much more kind of organic rather than structured and sort of conscious in the way that the idea of networking is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you're at the conference, if you're at TASA and you're feeling, you know, stressed and introverted and you see me, just come up and say, we'll have a cup of tea together. You know, probably won't author anything together, but we will have a cup of tea and go, oh, it's hard. And then, you know, we'll feel a bit better afterwards. So feel free to come up and say hi. Any of you that are feeling shy.
And also be aware, you know, if you look at the chat and what everyone's saying, everybody's in that situation, you know. So I often, you know, I feel exactly the same. Sometimes I get exhausted with interacting and so on, but I'm also aware that there are people who feel, you know, very, uncertain and so on. So I'm always the one who's sort of doing mum and saying, come on, let's all, you know, we'll go have lunch together, we'll go have dinner together. And you just grab whoever kind of looks as though they're at a loose end or whatever. And everybody should be doing that, you know, that people appreciate being invited to join a group, and, you know, you all sit together and have your lunch or go out for dinner or whatever, you know, after the conference sessions and so on. So yeah, don't feel that it's up to other people to make those, to initiate those opportunities for interaction, that we all should be doing that.
Thank you, Farida and Kathy. I found this presentation really, really interesting and really good for me. That I'm preparing for TASA, and I'm sure that many of the participants that we have today in this seminar are getting ready for a conference as well. So all your tips, I saw that there, reach out on the chat. She wrote a quick summary of all the tips, but you can find the recording of this session on the TASA YouTube channel. So thank you again, Farida and Kathy, for sharing your experience and tips with us today. And thank you for everyone for attending this session. We had quite a few participants today that I'm sure that are getting some tips from you. One thing that I wanted to say is that on the Tuesday at the TASA conference, we are organizing postgraduate date. So if you still didn't sign up, we are organizing some great sessions for the day, some mentoring, thematics groups, and some great activities. So just make sure that you sign up for the session. So again, thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.